a quagmire of our own making, why the United States lost the Vietnam War. Welcome, folks, to a deep dive into one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history, the Vietnam War. It's a tangled mess of military blunders, political machinations, and human suffering on a massive scale. Today, we're going to unpack the top reasons why the United States, with all its military might and economic power, found itself on the losing side of this epic struggle. Understanding the missteps and miscalculations in Vietnam offers crucial lessons for the present. We're going deep into the jungle, through the rice paddies into the halls of power, to understand how a superpower like the United States could get so bogged down. Buckle up, folks, it's going to be a wild ride. Lost in translation: Vietnam's political labyrinth. To understand how the Vietnam War unfolded, you have to understand the incredibly complex political landscape of Vietnam itself. This wasn't just a straightforward case of good versus evil, communism versus democracy, as it was often portrayed. Vietnam, even before the Americans arrived, was a cauldron of competing factions, each with their own agendas and ideologies. You had the Viet Minh, led by the enigmatic Ho Chi Minh, fighting for independence from colonial rule. You had the French desperately clinging to their Indo-Chinese empire, and caught in the middle, you had the Vietnamese people themselves, yearning for peace and self-determination. The United States, blinded by its Cold War fears, opted to support a series of increasingly unpopular South Vietnamese governments. By aligning itself with these regimes, the United States essentially backed the wrong horse, alienating many Vietnamese who might have otherwise been sympathetic to their cause. This fundamental misunderstanding of Vietnamese politics would plague American policymakers throughout the conflict. The phantom enemy, fighting a ghost you can't kill. The Viet Cong, the communist insurgency fighting for North Vietnam, were masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew the terrain like the back of their hands, blending seamlessly into the jungles and villages, seemingly materializing out of thin air to launch surprise attacks before vanishing just as quickly. This wasn't the kind of conventional warfare the United States military had trained for. American soldiers, accustomed to fighting on open battlefields with superior firepower, found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered in the dense jungles and suffocating heat. The Viet Cong employed booby traps, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics to devastating effect. They turned the environment itself into a weapon, disappearing into elaborate tunnel systems that stretched for miles. The psychological toll on American soldiers was immense. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, a phantom force that could strike anywhere, anytime. Tet, the turning point. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a watershed moment in the Vietnam War, a turning point that exposed the chasm between the rosy picture painted by the Johnson administration and the brutal realities on the ground. Launched during the Vietnamese New Year holiday of Tet, the offensive was a coordinated series of surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong across South Vietnam. It targeted major cities, military installations, and even the United States Embassy in Saigon, catching American and South Vietnamese forces completely off guard. Though the Tet Offensive was eventually repelled, it dealt a devastating blow to American morale and public opinion back home. The sheer scale and ferocity of the attacks shattered the illusion that the United States was winning the war. For the first time, the conflict was brought into the living rooms of Americans through vivid television coverage showcasing the brutality and chaos of the fighting. Search and destroy, a flawed strategy in a flawed war. The U.S. military strategy in Vietnam faced numerous challenges: unfamiliar terrain, guerrilla warfare, and a determined enemy. The strategy of attrition proved ineffective. Napalm and Agent Orange caused environmental damage and civilian casualties. The U.S. was trapped in a war it couldn't win militarily or afford to lose politically. A world divided. Vietnam and the Cold War chessboard. The Vietnam War wasn't just a localized conflict, it was a proxy war in the larger Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. North Vietnam was heavily supported by both the Soviets and China, who provided them with weapons, supplies, and training. This international support was crucial to North Vietnam's ability to sustain its war effort. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, became a lifeline for the North Vietnamese, allowing them to funnel troops and supplies into South Vietnam, despite American bombing campaigns. The United States, meanwhile, found itself increasingly isolated on the international stage. The war was condemned by many countries, including some of America's closest allies. This international condemnation, coupled with the growing anti-war movement at home, put immense pressure on the U.S. government to find a way out of the conflict. The home front unravels the rise of the anti-war movement. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition to the conflict grew steadily within the United States. Fueled by escalating casualties, the lack of progress, and the growing realization that the government had been less than truthful about the war, the anti-war movement became a powerful force in American society. College campuses became hotbeds of protest, with students organizing teach-ins, demonstrations, and draft card burnings. The movement drew support from a diverse cross-section of American society, including veterans, civil rights activists, clergy, and ordinary citizens who had come to believe the war was unjust and unwinnable. The anti-war movement had a profound impact on the political climate in the United States, putting immense pressure on the Johnson administration to end the war. Jungle Law, the terrain of defeat. The jungles of Vietnam were more than just a backdrop to the war. They were a formidable enemy in their own right. The dense foliage, the oppressive heat and humidity, the treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of disease all took a heavy toll on American soldiers, many of whom were ill-prepared for the realities of jungle warfare. The Viet Cong, on the other hand, were intimately familiar with the terrain. They used the jungle to their advantage, disappearing into the undergrowth, setting up ambushes, and turning the environment itself into a weapon. The vastness and impenetrability of the jungle made it difficult for the U.S. military to effectively deploy its superior firepower. The terrain also made it challenging to distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians, leading to tragic incidents of mistaken identity and civilian casualties. The Vietnam War was the first major conflict to be televised extensively, and the media coverage had a profound impact on public opinion. For the first time, Americans were able to see the brutality and chaos of war unfold in their living rooms, and the images they saw shocked and horrified them. The graphic footage of combat, the body bags being loaded onto airplanes, the interviews with wounded soldiers, all of it contributed to a growing sense of unease and disillusionment with the war. The media also played a role in exposing the credibility gap between the Johnson administration's optimistic assessments of the war and the grim realities on the ground. The relationship between the media and the military became increasingly strained, with the government accusing journalists of undermining the war effort and eroding public support. The Vietnam War saw U.S. presidents struggle with strategy and escalation. Kennedy increased involvement, but was assassinated. Johnson escalated the war, facing backlash. Nixon promised to end the war, but expanded it. The war highlighted the limits of American power. The Vietnam War cast a long shadow over American foreign policy and continues to shape debates about the use of military force to this day. It left an indelible mark on the American psyche, fostering a sense of disillusionment with government and a reluctance to intervene in foreign conflicts without a clear exit strategy. The war also had a profound impact on the lives of millions of Vietnamese people, both North and South. It led to the deaths of an estimated 2 million civilians, displaced millions more, and left a legacy of environmental devastation. The Vietnam War also had a lasting impact on the U.S. military, leading to a reassessment of military doctrine and training. The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex and multifaceted, serving as a cautionary tale about the limits of American power and the importance of understanding the history and culture of other nations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, folks. The Vietnam War is more than just a chapter in a textbook. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of asking tough questions about our role in the world. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like us to cover next. By understanding the past, we can hopefully navigate the present and future with a little more wisdom and a lot less bloodshed.